Hello everybody and welcome back to Revisiting. In the last episode, I covered a game that had a very mature and dark tone to it, so I decided that the next game I should cover would be more colorful and bright and nice. So, this is the Blob. It's a platforming game released originally in 2008 on the Nintendo Wii. Now, it's available on all modern consoles, but I've always had this on the Wii ever since I was in middle school. The Blob is a pretty unique type of platformer in the sense that what the goal of the game is that it all comes down to painting. Specifically, your character is a blob of paint rolling around a monochrome city, painting anything you land on or touch. As you paint the city, you get points that will unlock more unpainted territory that you can then go and paint more of. As a result, the Blob has this almost sandboxedness quality where you just get thrown into levels, and it's completely up to you how you want to go about progressing. And the game isn't very difficult. The controls can be a little difficult to work with, which we'll get to later, but the main premise of just running into things to win makes the Blob very accessible to anyone who wants to pick it up. The game isn't very long either. It's 10 levels long at about 37 minutes average each level, with a total of my specific playthrough reaching to just over 6 hours. If you play 2 levels of the game a day like I do, you'll finish the game's main story within a week. Of course, there's so much more to the game, so I'd like to start to dig into the Blob by talking about its story first. As mentioned before, you play as Blob, a round ball of paint that lives in the outskirts of Chroma City, a giant metropolis of saturated color, free expression, and lively citizens known as Radians. By the way, there's tons of color and painting puns in this game. One day, a giant menacing ship towers over the city, and soon starts dropping robots that sap the city of its color and vibrance. This ship is controlled by the Inkt, I-N-K-T, corporation, which is this fascist monochrome group that captures the citizens of Chroma City and makes them live in a dystopian version of the metropolis where the days are boring and the work is menial, and the style is uniform and bland, making the captured Radians turn into Gradians. This is where Blob and a set of uncaptured Radian rebels known as the Color Underground come in. Your job is to restore the color and life of Chroma City, and drive out Inkt, which includes its army of Inkies and its leader, Comrade Black. The game starts in The Last Resort, a resort-themed level where you meet the members of the Color Underground and help them on their quest to start a revolution within Chroma City. These characters are really cool. Each character is color coordinated and are designed with each of their traits in mind. Each character also has a type of challenge attached to them that you can complete as you go through the levels of the game. There's Biff, the orange strongman of the group. He has a gruff demeanor, and his challenges are based on defeating Inkies. These are really good for learning how to defeat certain enemy types. Zip is the blue speedy member, who speaks 1,000,000 words an hour, and delivers challenges where Blob has to follow markers to a set destination in a certain amount of time. These challenges are really good for learning the map and testing your platforming skills. Then there's Artie, a green Radian with artistic sensibilities. Her challenges have to do with painting things certain colors within a time limit. I find these challenges to be the ultimate test of skill within Blob, as you have to use your knowledge of the level in tandem with your paint management skills to complete these. Artie's challenges in the later parts of the game can be really testing. Finally, there is the Professor, who is the brown leader of the group. His challenges have to do with restoring the monuments of Chroma City back to their former selves. For these challenges, you have to get a certain amount of color and fill the monument with it until it's restored. These characters are very well realized. Even their speech patterns in the game, which is delivered in this submerged, bubbly kind of language, have their own unique flares to them, like Artie, who sounds French, or Biff, who sounds gruff. And this creative detail doesn't stop at the good guys. The Inkies also have great character design to them. They have these great helmets and their language is in barcodes. Even Comrade Black is fleshed out. He is cartoonishly short-tempered and looks like a dictator. Right away, the Blob has a very revolutionary feel to it, much in the same way as something like Jet Set Radio does. And I'm not even kidding on that comparison. In each game, the goal is to cover the town in paint, while the moral is about freedom of expression, and both have a very genre-driven soundtrack that is to die for. The composer of Blob, John Guscott, does amazing work here. His jazz-funk soundtrack is filled with so many upbeat, dynamic bangers that will stick in your brain after you're done playing the game. I actually used to have the CD album that came with this game that had the entire soundtrack on it, save for one track, which is fine, because that final level track is the only weak track here with how repetitive it is. I don't know where that CD went. The sound design is also well executed. There are effects like the peeling wet sound that plays as Blob travels, the musical flourishes that pop up whenever you paint anything, the heavy slam of an attack. Everything comes together to make the Blob as believable as possible. Pretty much everything aesthetically and narratively within the Blob for me is perfect for what it sets out to do. Which brings us to the gameplay, which I touched upon earlier. So let's get down to it. You'll first start out in the hub world of the game, where you can choose your level. Once you do that, you'll select what music track you want to be played in the background. Each track is composed toward a specific mood, and as you go through the game, you'll unlock more tracks. After you select your music, you'll be treated to a delightful cutscene. I actually find these to be reminiscent of the pre-level cutscenes in LEGO Rock Raiders, where they're like silent movies that want to convey a specific point of the game's world. Then comes this great comic book style intro that you can unveil panel by panel. These always inform you about the level ahead, your goal, and any new Inkt dangers. Once you're ready to go, you'll jump right into the level. As soon as you move out of the starting area, the professor will run a play-by-play of the section of the level you're in. After this briefing is when you can play. The Blob relies on the red, yellow, blue color model and the mixing within. Red and yellow make orange, blue and yellow make green, and red and blue make purple, and all three make brown. And how you get color is through these robots that carry paint around. You simply run into them, and you'll change into or mix with that color, as well as get 10 paint points. Paint points are both how much paint Blob is holding and his health. Get damaged at 0 paint points and you lose a life. Lose all your lives and it's game over. You only can get 100 paint points maximum. It's important you keep track of how many you have. You see, each thing you paint spends 1 paint point. Even with things you've already painted, if you are a different color than the object, you will paint it a new color and spend a paint point. Attacking enemies and completing the professor's challenges also cost paint points, so it's best to keep well stocked, although that also comes at its own cost. You see, the amount of paint points you have affect Blob's mobility. At smaller point values, Blob is small, fast, and responsive. Of course, he's also closer to losing a life. Meanwhile, Blob with a higher amount of paint in him makes him large and slow. He also gets a sticky quality to him, which can actually be useful for sliding along walls, but can also be a detriment if you're trying to go through a part of the level that requires more precise movements. I like this push-pull type system, although I can see that larger Blob turning other players off who like a little bit more of a snappiness to their platformers. However, to assume that the Blob is like your normal platforming game would make an ass out of you, but not me. Again, like I mentioned earlier, as you paint things into Blob, you get points. These points will unlock more parts of the level as you accumulate them, and once you get enough, you can finish the level. There are these gates that lock Blob out of parts of the level, and each of these gates can only be unlocked via the point milestones mentioned prior. To add to the challenge, there is a time limit to the level as a whole, and if you can't finish the level in that amount of time, it's game over. Thankfully, completing the Color Underground challenges give you lots of points and more time. Painting lots of buildings is also a good way to get points, especially when it comes to painting sets of buildings. You'll get bonus points for painting everything in a set. Look out for city blocks of buildings. Painting all of these will free a bunch of gradients. If you run over these gradients with a painted Blob, you'll liberate them back into radians, gaining more points and more time as a reward. Whenever you unlock a gate and enter a new part of the level, the game will play a mini cutscene showing you what's up ahead, and informing you on where you need to go. And as you go on, each section will get progressively more difficult. The Blob can also be quite the complete-a-thon. The game tracks how many buildings you painted, how much time it took you to beat the level, how many billboards you painted, how many gradients you liberated. There are these graffiti objects in the form of stiles, which add these patterns to the buildings you paint, and there is a medal system in the game to rank how much you've done in the level. There's a lot to do in each one of these levels. This is probably why the compass feature exists. At any time, you can hold a button and get a circular compass around Blob. The compass is pretty useful for finding paint bots or missions or any water. Oh yeah, there's water in the game as well. If there is ever a time where you don't like the color of paint that Blob is, you can run or dip into water, and that will return Blob into his basic clear form. Just be careful not to stay in the water for too long, or it will drain your paint points until they go down to 10. Water is also pretty useful if you ever get hit by an enemy or touch any ink in the level. If this happens, Blob will turn black and start losing paint points rapidly. Also, anything you touch will lose color. If this happens, your first and only priority should be to find water. And riding off of that, the difficulty of the game scales up rather nicely. The later levels really test your abilities to accumulate points, navigate the environments, and fight off the Inkt menace. Pools of ink will show up more as the game goes on, and even the walls will start to ooze ink. Meanwhile, the platforming becomes more elaborate in the later levels. Z-jumps are introduced, which are targets you can lock onto and jump toward, making for alternate routes and section skips. There are also these air cannons that you can use to launch Blob over large obstacles. And there are these monorails Blob can ride to get around the level quicker. As the game goes on, more enemy types are introduced. The variety of Inkies in the game are pretty diverse. You have your standard Inky, your cannon-holding Inky, there are tanks, and even turrets. The colored Inkies are my favorite enemy type. Basically, these Inkies can only be defeated by attacking them when Blob is the same color as their armor. Bumping into packs of different colors can be a real challenge. Comically, smashing the red ones is the closest thing the game has to actual blood. The only aspect of the game's difficulty curve effects that I would consider to be too much is how obtaining points and the reliance on challenges are dealt with. The game's flow can get interrupted because of having to break off from what you're doing and accumulate enough points to continue. This extends to both progression points and paint points. In the later levels of the game, I don't like how entire parts of the level don't become available unless you beat a specific challenge. It can be hard to know which one you should complete. It feels less like a natural progression of difficulty, and more so that the developers are forcing optional content onto the player. And while I'm criticizing the game, I have to talk about the camera. The camera can be a bit wonky. For the most part, it's entirely controllable by the player, but there are times when the camera will want to display things at a specific angle, or will try to compensate for objects in front of it by getting as close to Blob as possible, creating some frustration. This can also mess with the lock-on function, which is like Z-targeting from the Zelda franchise. Its default turn speed is also slow, but turning up the sensitivity of it in the options menu will make it go flying. You have to adjust it just right to get it to an acceptable speed, but those two things are really the only weak aspects the game has to offer. There are tons of reasons to play Blob. Unless you're colorblind, in which case you might be out of luck. I tried to see if any of the recent ports of the game has options for that, but I couldn't find anything. If you aren't colorblind, then this is definitely a game worth checking out. There's tons to do, from the story to side missions, completing challenges, multiplayer modes, and more. Everything is so well designed, there are lots of little details, especially when you color in more and more of an area, where not only does the color come back, but it seems like life itself has been brought back to the city. And it all ends with a satisfying, yet challenging final boss fight. The game can be a little overwhelming at times, but just remember, as long as you are painting something, you'll be fine. As for a final score, I remember playing this game as early as the 7th grade, so I think I might have some nostalgic bias going on there. Hopefully a high recommendation from me will be more than enough. And with that, that concludes another episode of Revisiting. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a nice day.